A curse whispered through time, a secret buried in the mist. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I'm your host, Mithrin. This community is incredible. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's dive into the mystery. The village of Raven's Hollow was not unlike many others that nestled quietly within the English countryside. A place of clipped hedges, polished silver teapots, and an air of unbroken calm. Its inhabitants prided themselves on their civility. Though beneath the politeness of afternoon teas and parish meetings lurked the ever-busy machinery of gossip. It was on one such day, warm and golden, with the scent of roses spilling into the lanes, that the annual summer fete was held upon the vicarage lawns. Stalls brimmed with sponge cakes, preserves, and embroidery. Children darted about with paper flags, and the brass band of the neighbouring parish contributed a cheerful, if occasionally uncertain, soundtrack. Among those present was Miss Jane Marple, a delicate figure in a pale straw hat, her knitting bag tucked neatly by her chair. She had been persuaded by Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, to preside over the judging of the flower arrangements, an honour Miss Marple accepted with her usual humility, though she kept a discerning eye upon the competitors' creations. The fete began, as fates often did, with laughter, chatter, and the faint undercurrent of rivalries disguised as good humour. Lady Harrington's roses were pitted against Mrs. Penfold's dahlias. Colonel Latham's strawberry jam was said to be a touch overboiled, though no one dared say so to his face. And then came the interruption. At precisely 3 o'clock, just as the raffle for a fine wicker picnic basket was about to be drawn, a sharp cry rang out across the green. Heads turned at once. Mrs. Elspeth Grant, new to the village and somewhat too fashionable for local tastes, was standing at the edge of the tea tent, her face drained of colour. Her parasol slipped from her hand as she staggered backward. On the ground beside her lay Mr. Alfred Chillingworth, the solicitor, his face oddly contorted. His cup of tea had spilled across the grass, mingling with the crumbs of a half-eaten scone. Gasps rose, followed by silence heavy enough to smother the buzzing of the bees. It was Mrs. Weatherby who spoke first, her voice trembling. Good heavens! He's dead! The brass band faltered, notes sliding away into an eerie hush. Children were hastily pulled back by their mothers. Colonel Latham bent down, felt for a pulse, and looked grimly at the gathering crowd. Miss Marple, sitting quietly, did not rush forward. She merely folded her hands upon her lap and watched the scene unfold with those pale, deceptively mild blue eyes. For she had seen in that one chaotic moment something that others, caught up in shock and drama, had entirely overlooked. The hush that followed Colonel Latham's grim pronouncement seemed to thicken the summer air, smothering the cheerful chatter that only moments before had carried across the vicarage lawn. Mr. Alfred Chillingworth, the solicitor whose very presence had always seemed so solid and uncompromising, lay motionless upon the grass, his cravat crooked, his spectacles knocked askew. For an instant, the villagers could not quite believe what they were seeing. After all, death belonged to the privacy of sick rooms and hospital wards, not the gaiety of a summer fete. It was Mrs. Weatherby who first regained her voice. "Someone fetch Dr. Groves." "Quickly!" she cried, her hands fluttering at her throat as though she might herself collapse without immediate assistance. Young Peter Wainwright, the vicar's son, darted off with boyish eagerness, clearly thrilled to be entrusted with such an errand, though his mother did not fail to notice the spark of excitement in his eye. To the young, death even shocking. Unexpected death possesses an air of drama that eclipses grief. A few of the braver souls edged closer to the stricken man. Mrs. Penfold clutched her parasol tightly, as though it might ward off some contagion, while Lady Harrington pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips. The solicitor, so recently alive, looked curiously diminished now, his stout figure oddly slack, his features betraying none of the acerbic wit he was known to employ in parish council meetings. Colonel Latham remained kneeling, his military bearing stiff with solemnity. "I fear Mrs. Weatherby is correct," he said gravely. "The poor fellow is quite gone. Heart failure, no doubt. These things happen suddenly." He straightened and brushed the grass from his knees, his tone more authoritative than compassionate, yet carrying the weight of his experience as both soldier and man of affairs. There was a general murmur of assent. Sudden illness, some whispered. A seizure, perhaps. It was easier, after all, to ascribe the horror to nature's cruelty than to contemplate darker possibilities. Only Mrs. Elspeth Grant, who had first given the alarm, seemed unconvinced. She stood with one hand clutching her handbag, her fashionable hat tilting precariously. I don't think it was an illness," she stammered. He looked so strange, as if he were choking. "His face, you all saw—" "Hysteria," sniffed Lady Harrington, recovering some of her composure. "One mustn't let one's imagination run away. Mrs. Grant, it is most unseemly." Yet several villagers had noted the peculiar contortion about Mr. Chillingworth's mouth, the way his hand had clutched at his throat, as though to claw away some unseen obstruction. Still none wished to voice it aloud. Not yet. Miss Marple, still in her chair beneath the shade of a linden tree, observed all this with the quiet detachment that so often concealed her keen attention. Her knitting remained untouched in her lap, her hands folded neatly together. She noted Mrs. Grant's trembling lips, Colonel Latham's brisk assumption of authority, Lady Harrington's sharp dismissal, and the ripple of unease spreading through the gathered villagers. Human nature, Miss Marple often reflected, was as predictable as it was endlessly varied. People revealed themselves in moments of stress with a clarity they might never show in calmer times. It was not long before Dr. Groves arrived, puffing slightly from his hurried walk across the village green. A stout man in middle age, his spectacles perched precariously upon his nose, the doctor pushed through the crowd with all the urgency of his profession. He knelt beside the body, examining the face, the throat, the unresponsive limbs. After several long moments he looked up, frowning. "I cannot give a full determination without an examination," he said, rising heavily. "But I confess this does not resemble a simple seizure. There are signs here, subtle but troubling." His eyes narrowed behind his spectacles and he lowered his voice. "We must send for the police." A collective gasp greeted this pronouncement. "The police!" Ravenshollow had not seen their involvement in any matter more serious than a stolen bicycle in over a decade. That they should be summoned now in the midst of a village fete seemed beyond comprehension. Colonel Latham bristled. "Surely that is unnecessary, Groves." The man was no longer young, and he carried a fair bit of weight. A weak heart, an excess of scones. Why should we leap to melodramatic conclusions? The doctor's gaze remained steady, because, Colonel, his lips bear the faintest trace of cyanosis, and his eyes looked closely. This was no mere failure of the heart. He paused, then added more quietly, "I suspect poisoning." The word fell upon the gathering like a chill wind. Poison, a weapon both subtle and cowardly, whispered about in stories but rarely encountered in life. Yet here it was, hinted at upon their very own vicarage lawn. Miss Marple did not move, though her eyes flickered to the teacup still lying upon the grass, its contents soaked into the soil. Poisoning, yes. She thought again of Mrs. Grant's frightened cry, of Mr. Chillingworth's sudden grimace. Such things, she knew, seldom occurred without reason. In her experience, death by poison was rarely random. It was chosen, deliberate, and that meant motive. The news spread quickly, carried by hushed voices through the crowd, until even those at the farthest stalls abandoned their cakes and raffle tickets to cluster around the scene. Gossip, always the lifeblood of the village, surged with renewed vigor. "Poison, did you hear?" whispered Mrs. Penfold to her companion. "In the tea, they say." "Oh, how dreadful. Why, I had a cup myself not 10 minutes before." She clutched at her chest as though expecting at any moment to feel the same fatal grip. "Nonsense," muttered Mr. Simmons, the greengrocer. "If the tea were poisoned, we'd all be laid out by now." "Oh no, it was his own cup, mark my words. Something put in it, something meant for him alone. Then who would wish him harm?" Mrs. Penfold pressed. "Mr. Chillingworth may have been, well, a touch officious, but he was respectable enough." "Respectable," said Simmons darkly, "but not beloved. Remember the dispute with the Harrington estate, eh? And the quarrel over old Mrs. Wetherell's will? There are those who'd say Alfred Chillingworth had enemies enough." And so the theories began, speculative whispers swelling into a tide of rumor that spread as quickly as the doctor's grim suggestion. The fete, once merry, now became a forum for suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with furtive glances. Every shared cup of tea, every offered scone, seemed newly sinister. Meanwhile, Miss Marple rose quietly from her seat and drifted nearer, not to peer at the body, that she left to Dr. Groves and the Colonel, but to watch the villagers themselves. She saw Mrs. Weatherby fussing with the vicar, her hands shaking so badly that she spilled sugar upon the tablecloth. She saw Lady Harrington withdraw into cold hauteur, her lips pressed into a thin line as she directed her maid to fetch the motor car. Mrs. Grant still stood apart, pale and shaken, as though uncertain whether her words would be welcomed or scorned. "Shocking, isn't it?" Miss Marple said gently, coming to stand beside her. Mrs. Grant jumped at the sound of her voice. "Oh, yes, it is. Quite dreadful. I saw him. Oh, I cannot get the sight out of my mind. You noticed something particular, perhaps?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost absent-minded, as though the question were no more than polite conversation. Mrs. Grant bit her lip. I thought he was choking. He looked at me, only for an instant, but it was as though he wished to speak and could not. Then he fell. She shuddered. And no one believes me. People seldom believe what does not fit easily with their expectations, Miss Marple observed. But truth has a way of persisting, Mrs. Grant. Always remember that. She gave a kindly smile, one that seemed to comfort the younger woman, though it offered no answers. By the time Inspector Crail arrived from the nearby town of Market Ledbury, the fete was in disarray. Stalls stood abandoned. The band had packed away their instruments in uneasy silence, and knots of villagers lingered in anxious conversation. The inspector, a solid man with sandy hair and a brusque manner, wasted little time in establishing order. "No one is to leave," he announced firmly, his voice carrying across the green. "We must take statements from all present. A man has died, and under circumstances that demand investigation. Your cooperation is expected." There were grumbles, mutters of indignation, but no outright defiance. The presence of uniformed constables quelled any thought of slipping away. Inspector Crail turned first to Dr. Groves. "You suspect poisoning?" The doctor nodded. "I cannot prove it until a post-mortem, but the signs are there." "Very well." The inspector cast a sharp glance around the gathering crowd. "Then we must determine how such a thing came to pass. Who provided Mr. Chillingworth with his tea?" A murmur rippled through the assembly. Mrs. Weatherby, flustered and pale, stepped forward. "It was from the tea tent, of course. We prepared cups for all who came." Nothing unusual, nothing at all. Yet only Mr. Chillingworth succumbed. Crail's tone was not unkind, but it carried the weight of authority, which suggests his cup and his cup alone was tampered with. "Did anyone hand it to him directly?" No one spoke at first. Then Mrs. Grant, hesitating, said, I saw him take it from the tray. But just before, yes, I recall now, he exchanged a few words with Lady Harrington. She was very insistent that he taste one of her scones. She placed the plate before him herself. All eyes turned to Lady Harrington, whose posture grew yet more rigid. "Really, Mrs. Grant," she said icily, "your nerves have played you false. I did indeed offer Mr. Chillingworth a scone, but as for his tea, I had no hand in it whatsoever." Miss Marple, listening, knitted together these scraps of information with the ease of one who had long studied human behavior. Already patterns emerged, the nervous chatter, the hasty denials, the eagerness to shift blame. Each revealed something, though the truth remained veiled. She said nothing, merely observed, her eyes alight with quiet interest. For Miss Marple knew that in Raven's Hollow, beneath the lace doilies and polished manners, secrets waited to be unearthed. And the death of Alfred Chillingworth would prove to be the key that unlocked them all. The inspector's keen eyes swept over the tense little assembly, lingering upon Lady Harrington longer than was perhaps necessary. She met his gaze coolly, her aristocratic chin lifted, but her fingers betrayed her by tightening upon the handle of her parasol until the knuckles whitened. Mrs. Grant, having spoken so impulsively, now looked uneasy, her glance darting from the inspector to Lady Harrington and back again, as though regretting her words yet unable to retract them. "Be that as it may," Inspector Crail said at last, "we must trace Mr. Chillingworth's last movements. He had his tea. He conversed, he ate a scone. He collapsed. Those are facts. Now, did anyone notice anything unusual as he was served? A hand too close to his cup, perhaps? Or a hesitation before he drank?" There was silence. The villagers looked from one to another, each unwilling to implicate a neighbour without certainty. Then Mrs. Penfold, plucking up courage, said, "He was speaking to Colonel Latham just before. I saw them. It looked like a quarrel, though I dare say it might only have been a lively discussion." "Indeed?" Inspector Crail turned sharply to the colonel, whose jaw stiffened. "Merely a difference of opinion regarding parish council business," the colonel replied brusquely. Chillingworth was a stubborn man, quick to insist upon his own view. Nothing more than that. And the subject? Crail pressed. Drainage ditches, if you must know, the colonel said with a snort. Hardly a matter for murder. But Miss Marple, who had edged a little nearer, observed the faint flush creeping along the colonel's neck, and the way his eyes did not quite meet the inspector's. To her, such small betrayals were far more eloquent than words. Dr. Groves, meanwhile, had covered the body with a sheet procured from the vicarage, and the constables were arranging for it to be taken away for examination. The once cheerful lawn now bore an air of solemnity, the bunting drooping, the tables of cakes and jams abandoned to the wasps. The fete was over, extinguished as though by a sudden storm. Miss Marple moved quietly among the villagers, speaking here and there in her gentle, almost distracted fashion. Few paid her much mind. She was, after all, the vicar's elderly neighbour, fond of knitting and gossip, and certainly not one to trouble the police. Yet the questions she posed, mild and seemingly inconsequential, were not without purpose. To Mrs. Weatherby she murmured, "How fortunate you had such a large attendance this year. I suppose many cups of tea were served?" "Oh, dozens," Mrs. Weatherby exclaimed, though her eyes were still clouded with distress. "We were scarcely able to keep up. My poor maid Elsie had to carry tray after tray. And now, oh, to think that such a dreadful thing should occur under our roof." She dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "Elsie carried the tray?" Miss Marple inquired with the air of one recalling some small domestic detail. Yes, indeed. Though she is a good girl, very reliable." "Reliability is such a blessing," Miss Marple said gently. "And did she herself pour the tea?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "No, I believe Lady Harrington helped for a time. She insisted upon it, said our poor girl looked overtaxed. It was meant most kindly, I'm sure." "Most kind indeed," murmured Miss Marple. Her eyes, however, glinted ever so slightly. Elsewhere, Mrs. Penfold, still fluttering with excitement, confided to her friend that she had seen young Henry Chillingworth, the nephew, hovering near the tent earlier. "He's a restless sort," she whispered. "Always with that notebook of his scribbling. I should not be surprised if he noticed something. So if only someone thought to ask him." The inspector, meanwhile, had begun to take statements in earnest, seating himself at one of the abandoned stalls and calling up each villager in turn. He listened with brusque impatience, making quick notes, his brow furrowed. Theories sprang up like mushrooms that Mr. Chillingworth had many enemies, that his legal practice had embroiled him in disputes, that he had been harsh, even vindictive, in matters of inheritance. Several recalled the bitterness surrounding Mrs. Wetherell's will, in which unexpected beneficiaries had been named to the exclusion of expected ones. Others hinted at quarrels with tenants, unpaid bills, or sharp dealings over land rights. "All smoke, perhaps," Inspector Crail muttered. "But somewhere there's fire." It was then that young Henry Chillingworth stepped forward, tall and eager, his dark hair falling untidily over his brow. He was scarcely more than 20, an Oxford undergraduate home for the summer. "With all the restless energy of youth, Inspector," he said, "I should like to give a statement." "Very well," Crail said, eyeing him. "What have you to add?" "I saw my uncle earlier," Henry began, his voice tight. "He was speaking with Mrs. Grant. They seemed well heated. I could not hear their words, but his manner was harsh, and she looked quite distressed. He was always harsh, especially with women. He enjoyed belittling them." Mrs. Grant flushed, her hand tightening on her handbag. "It is true," she admitted reluctantly. He threatened me, said things about— Oh, I do not wish to repeat them." "What sort of things?" pressed the inspector. Mrs. Grant hesitated, glancing around at the curious faces, then said in a low voice, "Personal things. Matters from my past that I had trusted were forgotten. He said he might make them known. It was cruel. He delighted in cruelty." A murmur of sympathy ran through the crowd. Mrs. Grant, the fashionable newcomer, had not been universally liked. Yet the idea of Mr. Chillingworth bullying her so ruthlessly struck many as intolerable. "And when was this?" Crail asked sharply. "Only an hour before he died." The inspector tapped his pencil against his notebook. "So, a quarrel with the colonel. A quarrel with Mrs. Grant, not to mention all his other disputes. The man seems to have lived surrounded by grudges." Henry Chillingworth lifted his chin. "I am not sorry he is gone," he said suddenly, his voice ringing across the lawn. "But I swear I had no hand in it." The declaration caused a stir, for it was unusual in Raven's Hollow to speak ill of the dead, especially so soon. Yet there was a raw honesty in his tone that could not be denied. Miss Marple, listening, felt a pang of compassion. She had seen such frankness in young men before, often misunderstood, often punished for their candor. Henry's words, though harsh, carried the ring of truth. She doubted he had poisoned his uncle. But she made a note, as she always did, to remember the connections between quarrels, tempers, and opportunities. The sun dipped lower as the inspector continued his questioning. Villagers grew restless, yet no one dared leave. The fête's gaiety had utterly vanished, replaced by a tense atmosphere in which every word seemed to carry hidden weight. Small alliances were visible in the very positions people took. Mrs. Penfold hovering loyally near Lady Harrington, Mr. Simmons, the greengrocer, whispering with the vicar, young Henry standing defiantly apart, while Mrs. Grant shrank into uneasy silence. Miss Marple, moving softly among them, seemed almost invisible. She asked nothing directly about the poison, nor about opportunities, but rather about the arrangements of tables, the trays of cups, who had fetched water for the urn. Small questions, domestic questions, which no one thought important. Yet to her they were threads in a tapestry, threads that would, with patience, reveal the whole design. When at last Inspector Crail allowed the villagers to disperse, it was with strict instructions that none should leave the village until further notice. The fete disbanded in somber silence. Children were hushed, baskets of cakes carried away unsold, the bunting taken down without a note of music to accompany it. Raven's Hollow returned to its cottages and gardens under a cloud of unease. Miss Marple walked home at a measured pace, her eyes thoughtful. In her quiet sitting room, she took up her knitting, the needles clicking gently as she reflected upon the day. Poison, yes. It was a coward's weapon, but also a calculated one. And Alfred Chillingworth had been a man to accumulate enemies. The Colonel's pride, Mrs. Grant's secrets, Lady Harrington's estate disputes, Henry's resentment, each was a thread. But which thread had tightened into a noose? She thought of the tea tent, of Lady Harrington's insistence upon helping, of the maid Elsie's overburdened tray. She thought of Mrs. Grant's cry, so instinctive, so convinced of choking. She thought, too, of the solicitor's reputation. Sharp in business, merciless in judgment, unafraid of wielding knowledge like a blade. A man such as that left behind more bitterness than fondness. Yet Miss Marple, in her long years of observation, had learned that murder seldom arose from the obvious quarrels, the shouted threats, the public disputes. More often it sprang from the small, quiet grudges, the hidden shames, the delicate matters of the heart that could never be shouted from rooftops. She set her knitting aside and looked out across her neat garden, where the evening light gilded the hollyhocks and roses. Somewhere among the villagers of Raven's Hollow lay the truth of Alfred Chillingworth's death, and though the inspector would pursue his investigation with diligence, it would fall to her, quiet, observant Jane Marple, to perceive the detail that all others overlooked. For even now, she felt certain of one thing. The poison had not been administered by chance. It had been placed with intention, by a hand that knew precisely what it was doing. And that hand, hidden now in the comfort of village respectability, would reveal itself soon enough, if only one knew how to look. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively peaceful, the sort of day that might have been devoted to roses and tea in the garden, had not the shadow of Alfred Chillingworth's sudden death still hung so heavily over Raven's Hollow. The air carried that strange hush that lingers in a village after calamity, as though even the birds and bees paused out of respect. Yet beneath that quiet surface lay a restless tide of speculation. The villagers had risen early, eager to exchange the newest whispers before the truth could overtake them. By the time the church clock struck 9, everyone from the grocer to the postmistress had contributed some opinion as to who had tampered with Mr. Chillingworth's tea and why. At the heart of these speculations was Inspector Crail, who had taken a room at the inn to conduct his inquiries. He moved briskly that morning, notebook in hand, his mind already set upon a course. For in the hours since the fete, he had sifted through the villagers' tales and, as policemen so often must, narrowed his gaze to the likeliest suspect. That suspect, he believed, was Mrs. Elspeth Grant. The reasoning, though not without flaw, was straightforward. She had quarrelled with Chillingworth not long before his death. She had been the first to cry out, the one to draw attention to the choking as though expecting it. And she had admitted that the solicitor had threatened her with exposure of some past indiscretion. Motive, opportunity, and behaviour all pointed toward her. Crail shared these thoughts with Dr. Groves as they stood outside the vicarage, where they had arranged to meet once the post-mortem results were confirmed. "It fits too neatly to ignore," he said, snapping his notebook shut. "Mrs. Grant had cause. She had the chance. Poison, you know, is not a weapon taken up lightly. It requires forethought. And she strikes me as a woman of determination." Dr. Groves, more cautious, shook his head. "Perhaps. But the evidence remains circumstantial. And Miss Marple, Miss Marple," the inspector's mouth tightened. "She means well, I dare say. But these village ladies and their theories. I prefer facts, Doctor." Yet even as he said it, he cast a glance across the lane where Miss Marple herself was strolling with her parasol, seemingly intent upon the geraniums in a neighbour's garden. Her step was unhurried, her expression benign, and nothing about her suggested an eagerness to embroil herself in police business. Nevertheless, Inspector Crail felt a flicker of unease, for there was something about the old lady's eyes, mild though they seemed, that gave the impression of seeing more than she said. Miss Marple had, in fact, heard enough of the village murmurings to know where suspicion was settling. Poor Mrs. Grant, she thought with quiet concern, would make a convenient culprit, too new to the community to inspire loyalty, too fashionable to escape envy, and too candid in her distress to appear composed. Such women were easily sacrificed to satisfy the village's need for order. But Miss Marple, whose long years had taught her that the obvious rarely proved true, felt no such conviction. Later that morning, Mrs. Grant herself called upon Miss Marple, her cheeks pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. She clutched her gloves as though they might shield her from the judgment of the village. "They all suspect me," she said in a low, urgent voice as soon as the door was closed. "I can feel it, the stares, the whispers. And that inspector. He looks at me as though he knows already. What shall I do?" "Sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, guiding her to a chair by the window. "Have a cup of tea. No one ever thinks clearly without it." Mrs. Grant obeyed, though her hands trembled as she took the cup. "I am not a murderer, Miss Marple. Whatever you may have heard, whatever anyone says, I swear it." "My dear child," Miss Marple said with the air of one soothing a frightened bird, "I have heard nothing to the contrary. But tell me, why should Mr. Chillingworth threaten you so cruelly? What past matter did he hold over you?" There was a long pause, broken only by the ticking of the clock. "At last," Mrs. Grant whispered, "before I came here I was in London. My husband died years ago, you see, and I was left vulnerable. There was a gentleman, a mistake, nothing more. But Chillingworth knew. How, I cannot imagine. He said he would expose me, ruin me in this village where I had hoped to begin again." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind. "And you quarrelled?" "Yes, he took pleasure in it, in seeing me squirm. But I left him. I went straight to the tea tent and had a cup myself. I could not have poisoned his. It is impossible." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "People are often quick to believe the worst of a stranger. But truth will out, Mrs. Grant, it always does." When the young widow departed, somewhat comforted, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with thoughtful fingers. She did not dismiss Mrs. Grant as incapable of the deed, but neither did she see in her the cold calculation poison requires. No, this murder had about it the mark of something older, more rooted in long-standing animosity than in recent threats. That afternoon, Inspector Crail summoned Lady Harrington and Colonel Latham for questioning at the inn. Word of this spread quickly, and by the time the interviews concluded, the village buzzed anew. Lady Harrington had been cool, insisting she had merely assisted with the tea out of kindness. "I had no interest in Mr. Chillingworth's affairs," she declared. "Yes, he handled some business for my estate, but nothing of consequence. To suggest otherwise is absurd." Yet her sharp tone and imperious manner did little to quell suspicion. Mrs. Penfold, eager as always to add fuel to gossip, told her neighbour that Lady Harrington's fortune was not so secure as it appeared. There was talk of debts, you know, and Mr. Chillingworth was not inclined to be charitable. If he pressed her, who knows what she might do. As for Colonel Latham, his interview left the inspector dissatisfied. The colonel admitted to quarrelling over parish council matters, but his brusque dismissal of further questions only deepened Crail's conviction that he hid something. "Toy is proud," the inspector muttered afterward. "Pride often leads men to rash deeds." By evening the theories had crystallized into two camps, those who whispered that Mrs. Grant, cornered by her past, had silenced the solicitor, and those who muttered darkly about Lady Harrington's debts or Colonel Latham's temper. Few considered Henry, the nephew, though his declaration of relief at his uncle's death still echoed uneasily in some ears. Miss Marple, listening from her quiet corner in the post office, noted all these currents with interest. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same everywhere. When trouble struck, people sought to assign blame quickly, preferably to those least able to defend themselves. Yet true guilt seldom lay where suspicion fell most readily. That night she reviewed the facts as she knew them. The poison had been in the tea, so the doctor believed. The tea had been poured by several hands, carried by Elsie with Lady Harrington assisting. Mr. Chillingworth had quarrelled with at least 3 people that very day. And yet, it was not the quarrels that troubled her most, but the solicitor's reputation for meddling in private affairs. A man who dealt in wills and secrets often knew more than he ought, and sometimes such knowledge proved fatal. The next morning brought confirmation from Dr. Groves. Poison indeed. Though he did not disclose the precise substance, he admitted it had been administered in small, deliberate measure, almost certainly in the tea. Inspector Crail wasted no time. He summoned Mrs. Grant once more, his questions sharp, his manner stern. "You had the strongest motive," he told her bluntly. "You admit to quarrelling. You feared exposure, and you had access to the tea." "I swear I did nothing," she cried. "You must believe me." But Crail was unmoved. "I believe you had opportunity and cause. Unless you can prove otherwise, Mrs. Grant, you remain my principal suspect." The village seized upon this with glee. "They will arrest her soon," whispered Mrs. Penfold. "Mark my words. And perhaps it is for the best. Better one outsider taken away than to believe one of us capable." Miss Marple, however, felt a quiet disquiet. The inspector's case was too neat, too hasty. Life, she knew, was rarely so obliging. And as she sat that afternoon in her garden, the bees humming among the roses, she recalled the way Lady Harrington had insisted upon assisting in the tea tent, and the Colonel's evasive flush. Most of all, she recalled Mr. Chillingworth himself, his delight in cruelty, his knowledge of others' secrets. Poison was not a crime of passion, swiftly committed in anger. It was the crime of calculation, of patience, of planning. And whoever had slipped it into Alfred Chillingworth's cup had done so with cool deliberation, knowing precisely what outcome to expect. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted another row. Inspector Crail might be eager to close his case with Mrs. Grant's arrest, but she was certain he was wrong. The true culprit was still hidden among them, shielded by respectability and the village's eagerness to believe in an easy solution. And she, Jane Marple, would find them, by watching, by listening, and by trusting in the unerring patterns of human nature that had never yet failed her. The afternoon following Dr. Groves's confirmation of poison found the village in a state of sharpened agitation. The air itself seemed charged, as though every hedge and every stone wall were whispering of guilt and betrayal. Mrs. Grant, though not formally arrested, had withdrawn into her cottage, blinds drawn, venturing out only to fetch milk from the doorstep. The rest of Raven's Hollow, meanwhile, carried on with forced cheer, for there is nothing so intolerable to a village as uncertainty. Better to whisper and assign blame than to dwell upon the possibility that one's very neighbour might be a murderer. Inspector Crail continued his inquiries with a dogged determination, but to Miss Marple's mind, he was becoming ever more narrowly focused. "Suspicion is like a hound," she reflected quietly as she sat in her garden with her knitting. "Once it catches a scent, it refuses to consider another trail, and sometimes that trail leads to a fox, but sometimes to a poor harmless rabbit." She thought again of Mrs. Grant's visit, of her trembling voice and frightened eyes. Yes, the woman had secrets. Most women did in Miss Marple's experience, but secrets were not in themselves motives for murder. There was another element, something quieter, something she alone had noticed, though it had not yet fully taken shape in her mind. It hovered there like a pattern in lace, indistinct until one turned the work just so. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple took a gentle walk along the lane toward the vicarage. There she found Elsie, the maid, scrubbing the tea trays with unnecessary vigor. The girl's brow was furrowed, her lips pressed tightly together. Miss Marple paused, leaning upon her walking stick, though she did not strictly need it. "Good evening, Elsie. A tiresome task, I see." The maid straightened, startled, then managed a strained smile. "It's got to be done, miss. The mistress says everything must be scoured after what happened. Of course. Such an unfortunate business, and such a heavy burden for you, carrying all those trays on fete day. I hope you had some help." Elsie sighed. "A bit. Her ladyship, Lady Harrington, she lent a hand. Not that I wanted her to, but she insisted. Poured half the cups herself, she did. Said she knew how." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Very kind of her. And she poured Mr. Chillingworth's cup too, perhaps." Elsie frowned in thought. I don't rightly remember. She was bustling about, putting cups here and there. But I know one thing. She set down a cup on the corner of the tray, said it was for the solicitor, as he was particular about the strength. I never thought much of it till now." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically and let the conversation drift to safer topics, but in her mind a note had struck. A cup set aside for Mr. Chillingworth, at Lady Harrington's own insistence. A small detail easy to overlook. Yet in her long years of observing people, Miss Marple had learned that it is often in the small, deliberate gestures that truth reveals itself. She continued her walk home, pausing by the post office, where Mrs. Penfold and Mr. Simmons were in heated conversation. They fell silent at her approach, but she gave them a kindly smile and passed on. The gossip was as thick as ever, and she had no doubt it now revolved around Mrs. Grant's supposed guilt. Yet the hidden clue remained. Lady Harrington's hand in the tea service, unnecessary, insistent, and curiously overlooked by everyone but Elsie. The following morning brought another ripple of intrigue. Colonel Latham was seen leaving the inn where the inspector lodged, his expression dark and thunderous. It was said that Crail had pressed him hard about his quarrel with Chillingworth, and the colonel had not taken kindly to such questioning. Some claimed he had stormed out declaring that he would not be treated like a common criminal. Others whispered that his temper was proof of guilt. Miss Marple, hearing this, reflected upon the colonel's pride, his need for authority. Such men did not take humiliation well, yet pride alone was not enough. Poison required patience, not temper, and though she did not dismiss him entirely, she felt once more that his bluster was a distraction rather than a clue. That afternoon, she encountered Henry Chillingworth walking briskly across the green, his notebook in hand. He greeted her with a distracted air, yet his eyes were bright with some inward fire. "Miss Marple," he said, "they're going to blame Mrs. Grant, aren't they? It's easier that way. But I don't believe it. My uncle had far more dangerous enemies." "Oh? And who might those be?" Miss Marple asked mildly, as though humoring youthful exaggeration. Henry hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He dealt with people's secrets. Wills, property, debts. He knew everything about everyone. My uncle wasn't above using that knowledge for his own advantage. If Lady Harrington feared exposure, or if the colonel stood to lose money, either of them might have wished him dead. But Mrs. Grant, she was just a scapegoat." Miss Marple looked at him with quiet approval. "You have a sharp mind, Henry. But youth is often impatient, and impatience can blind us. It is best to let things unfold. The truth has a habit of coming to light." He flushed as though chastened, yet she saw in him a genuine desire for justice, however clumsily expressed. Perhaps he might prove useful, though she would be cautious in how much she shared. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to comfort Mrs. Weatherby, who remained distressed that such horror had marred her fate. Several villagers were present, sipping tea with exaggerated care. Conversation turned inevitably to the inspector's inquiries. "I heard," whispered Mrs. Penfold, "that they found traces of the poison in Mr. Chillingworth's own cup. So it could not have been accidental. It must have been placed there deliberately." Lady Harrington, seated in a high-backed chair, gave a cold little laugh. "Really, Penfold, one must not indulge in wild speculation. The inspector has matters in hand. Let us leave it to the authorities." "But you helped with the tea, did you not?" asked Mrs. Weatherby innocently. Lady Harrington's expression flickered, then smoothed. "Merely for a few minutes, a trifle. One must be charitable after all. Poor Elsie was flustered. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes lowered, but her mind was alert. That flicker of expression, momentary, betraying more than words, was telling. Lady Harrington did not like being reminded of her role in the tea service. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple allowed herself a gentle remark, delivered in her softest voice. "It is curious, is it not, how very particular people can be about tea? Some like it weak, others strong. I remember once in St. Mary Mead, a dear old gentleman insisted on pouring his own, for fear his cup might be muddled with another's. He always said that mistakes in small things can lead to dreadful consequences." Her remark was met with polite laughter, though Lady Harrington's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. Miss Marple, watching through lowered lashes, noted it carefully. Such tremors were seldom the result of mere nerves. They often arose when a guilty memory stirred. Later that night, alone in her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected upon the growing web. Mrs. Grant remained the inspector's chief suspect, yet the hidden clue, the solitary cup, set aside by Lady Harrington, pointed elsewhere. The Colonel's pride, Henry's bitterness, Mrs. Grant's secrets, all were plausible. Yet none bore the quiet deliberation of poison as clearly as Lady Harrington's calculated gesture. Still, Miss Marple was not ready to declare. One clue was never enough. It must be tested, observed in relation to others. She would wait, watch, and gather. Already she felt certain that the unravelling of this tapestry had begun, and the pattern would soon reveal itself in full. The village, meanwhile, remained restless. Every whispered conversation carried the undercurrent of fear. Fear that the inspector might arrest the wrong person. Fear that the true murderer still walked among them, unseen. Doors were locked earlier than usual, curtains drawn tight. Children were kept closer at hand, and the usual gaiety of the summer evenings was subdued. Miss Marple, however, slept soundly, her conscience untroubled. For she knew that the truth lay not in speculation, but in the steady observation of human nature. And she had already seen enough to know where to look next. The morning after the vicarage gathering, the village awoke with a sense of strained anticipation. For while Inspector Crail had made no formal announcement, it was widely assumed that an arrest would soon follow. The villagers, eager both for resolution and for something new to discuss, began to gather in twos and threes along the lanes, their conversations quickening whenever a familiar figure passed. The fear that the murderer still walked freely among them was softened only by the hope that it might all be tidily settled before the week's end. Miss Marple, however, was not content to wait upon the inspector's conclusions. She rose earlier than usual, set her knitting in its basket, and made her way toward the post office with her usual unhurried step. There she encountered Mrs. Penfold, whose tongue was as sharp as her eyes. "Mark my words, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penfold declared. "It will be that Mrs. Grant. They say the inspector has all but proven it. Poison is just the sort of thing a woman like her might use. Fashionable, yes, but sly. Not the sort of murder a gentleman would stoop to." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "And yet, dear Mrs. Penfold, one must remember that men, too, are not above slyness when it suits them. Why, I once knew a colonel, retired, of course, who slipped arsenic into the dog biscuits of his rival's prize terrier, all because the poor animal barked too much. Quite a small matter, but it shows that no crime is too petty or too sly for pride to justify." Mrs. Penfold blinked, uncertain how to respond, and Miss Marple continued on her way, leaving behind a trail of perplexity. For she knew that when minds are too firmly fixed upon a single suspect, a gentle nudge of contradiction can sometimes loosen them. At the inn, Inspector Crail was indeed preparing his case. He had summoned Mrs. Grant once more, pressing her with questions that grew sharper with every passing hour. Yet Miss Marple, watching discreetly from the tea-room as the widow entered with drawn face, felt only pity. The inspector was forcing a fit upon the facts, as though hammering a square peg into a round hole. Meanwhile, other undercurrents were stirring. Henry Chillingworth, restless and indignant at the treatment of Mrs. Grant, had begun to make inquiries of his own. He spoke to villagers who had dealt with his uncle, gathering stories of grievances and quarrels, writing them feverishly into his notebook. Some shook their heads at his boldness, others admired it, but all provided scraps of truth that added to the tapestry. It was Henry who first learned of a curious fact concerning Lady Harrington's estate. The solicitor, it seemed, had been pressing her for repayment of certain loans, hinting at selling portions of her land if she did not comply. To a woman of her pride, the humiliation would have been intolerable. Henry, flushed with this discovery, hastened to share it with Miss Marple as he encountered her near the churchyard. "You see, Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "it must be Lady Harrington. She had the most to lose. My uncle was going to expose her, force her into ruin. She couldn't bear it, so she poisoned him." Miss Marple regarded him with kindly eyes. "That is one possibility, dear Henry. But in life, as in knitting, one must be careful not to drop a stitch. A pattern may seem clear at first glance, yet one loose thread can unravel the whole." He flushed, frustrated by her calm. "But don't you see? She even handled the tea." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "She did." And she left it at that, allowing the young man's conviction to burn brightly without fanning it herself. For she knew that eagerness often blinded one to subtler truths. That same day another revelation surfaced. Colonel Latham, long regarded as upright if somewhat pompous, was discovered to have engaged in a bitter dispute with Mr. Chillingworth over a parcel of land adjoining his estate. The colonel had wished to purchase it for training grounds, but Chillingworth had blocked the sale, citing legal complications. Some whispered that money had exchanged hands in questionable ways, and that the colonel's honor had been touched to the quick. When confronted, the colonel dismissed the matter with his usual brusqueness. "Business affairs," he growled. Chillingworth was a meddler, always poking his nose where it didn't belong. "But I am not a man to stoop to poison. Steel, perhaps, but never teacups." Yet his vehemence, overheard by half the village, only added fuel to the fire. For the louder a man protested, the more his neighbors wondered what he sought to conceal. By evening, Raven's Hollow was awash with suspicion. 3 names now circulated with equal fervor: Mrs. Grant, Lady Harrington, and Colonel Latham. Each had motive, each had quarreled with the victim, and each, in the eyes of their neighbors, was perfectly capable of the crime. The inspector leaned toward Mrs. Grant still, but the villagers themselves were divided, and gossip flowed more freely than the ale at the inn. Miss Marple, watching from her quiet corner, saw in this swirl of suspicion not confusion but revelation. For it is in gossip, she knew, that truth often hides, disguised among exaggerations and lies. When people speak too freely, they sometimes reveal more than they intend. It was during one such overheard conversation, as she passed beneath the open window of the postmistress's cottage, that she caught a remark which pricked her interest. The postmistress, speaking to Mrs. Penfold, mentioned that Mr. Chillingworth had been sending letters abroad, letters which she believed contained matters of great delicacy. "He posted one only last week," the woman said. "Looked official, but his hand was trembling when he signed it. And he paid extra for speed." Miss Marple paused on the lane, her heart quickening though her step did not. Letters abroad, confidential, hurried. That, she thought, might be the key. For in her long life, she had seen how foreign entanglements could ripple back into the smallest of English villages, upsetting all order. She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through the vicar, whose position often brought him into knowledge of parish correspondence. The following day brought a tense confrontation at the inn. Inspector Crail, growing impatient, openly accused Mrs. Grant of withholding the truth. "You had reason to fear him, madam. You admitted as much. Unless you come forward with an alibi, I shall have no choice but to act." Mrs. Grant wept openly, denying all, but her protests fell upon deaf ears. Lady Harrington, hearing of this, expressed cold satisfaction. "It is just as I said. These outsiders bring nothing but trouble. Once she is gone, the matter will be settled." But Miss Marple, present at the inn under the pretense of ordering tea, quietly remarked, "How curious, Lady Harrington, that you should feel so certain. In my experience, certainty is a dangerous thing until one has all the pieces of the puzzle." Lady Harrington stiffened, her lips tightening, and for an instant her composure wavered. Miss Marple saw it, as she saw the flicker in Elsie's eyes when Lady Harrington's name was spoken. The maid, though silent, looked away quickly as though fearing to betray some knowledge she carried. It was then that the hidden clue, faint though it still was, began to settle in Miss Marple's mind. The solitary cup, the insistence of Lady Harrington, the nervous glance of Elsie, the tremor in Lady Harrington's hand. All small things easily dismissed, yet together they formed the outline of a design. Not proof, never proof, but suggestion. And suggestion, in Miss Marple's experience, was the seed from which truth eventually blossomed. As she returned home that evening, the sky streaked with crimson, Miss Marple reflected upon the curious nature of secrets. Colonel Latham had his pride, Mrs. Grant her past, Lady Harrington her debts, and Henry his resentment. Each secret lay like a stone in the garden path, seemingly solid, yet capable of tripping the unwary. The inspector, she feared, would seize upon the first stone and stumble blind to the rest. But Miss Marple had no intention of stumbling. She would continue to observe, to listen, and to wait for the moment when the pattern became clear. And when that moment came, she knew it would reveal not only who had poisoned Alfred Chillingworth, but why. And it was often the why that mattered most. For in every crime, Miss Marple believed the heart of the matter lay not in the weapon, nor in the opportunity, but in the human soul behind it. And in Raven's Hollow, where every cottage held its whisper of pride, shame, or longing, the soul of a murderer was even now betraying itself to those with the patience to see. The tension in Raven's Hollow did not ease as the week wore on. If anything, it thickened, settling over the cottages and hedgerows like an invisible fog. Neighbours who once greeted one another with cheerful nods now regarded each other with careful reserve. The air of suspicion weighed upon every errand, every whispered conversation, every door that closed too quickly. Inspector Crail pressed ahead, intent upon securing enough grounds to charge Mrs. Grant. But to those who watched closely, and Miss Marple always did, it was plain that the inspector was growing impatient, eager for resolution before the village's unease boiled over. It was on the third evening after the fete that the next disturbance came, sudden and startling enough to send the whole village buzzing once more. Miss Marple heard of it first from her maid, who came in breathless from the shop with wide eyes and trembling voice. "They've broken into Chillingworth's office, miss. At the solicitor's house. Windows smashed, papers scattered. The constable says it was ransacked." Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly, though her heart quickened. Burglary, and at such a time. It was no coincidence. Someone sought something, papers, letters, evidence, and sought it desperately enough to risk discovery. She walked to the scene under the pretense of concern, and there, amid the cluster of villagers gathered outside the solicitor's modest brick office, she saw the inspector, his face grim in the fading light. "Forced entry," he announced curtly. Drawers pulled out, files rifled. Whoever did this was searching for something particular. But whether they found it, that remains to be seen. Inside the office was indeed a shambles. Legal papers lay strewn across the floor, the smell of old ink and parchment heavy in the air. A single candlestick had been knocked from the desk, its wax smeared across a stack of deeds, and in the middle of the mess, the inspector held up a torn envelope, its foreign postmark still visible. "Letters abroad," he muttered. "The postmistress mentioned them, did she not?" Miss Marple, standing quietly at the threshold, lowered her eyes so no one might notice the flicker of recognition there. Yes, the letters. She had not been mistaken. And now someone had sought them, perhaps fearing what they might reveal. The inspector, of course, took this as further evidence against Mrs. Grant. Who else, he said with satisfaction, would be so desperate to conceal her past? These must have been her letters, and she has come to destroy them before they could damn her. But Miss Marple was not convinced. The ransacking bore a different signature. Desperation, yes, but also calculation. She had known women in panic, and their actions were rarely so methodical. This had the look of someone accustomed to control, someone who could scatter chaos while aiming for a single prize. And she recalled with that clarity age sometimes lends Lady Harrington's tremor when her involvement with the tea was mentioned, and the Colonel's pride when accused of quarrels. No, this burglary pointed elsewhere, though the inspector did not see it. The villagers, however, seized upon it with glee. By morning the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Some declared it proved Mrs. Grant guilty beyond doubt. Others insisted it was a trick, staged to divert suspicion. Henry Chillingworth, fiery as ever, proclaimed to anyone who would listen that it was his aunt's doing, Lady Harrington herself, desperate to destroy records of debt. His words carried farther than he intended, for by evening even the shopkeepers spoke openly of her possible guilt. Lady Harrington, confronted with these whispers, responded with icy disdain. "Really, the insolence! That boy is a fool and the villagers little better. Do they imagine I should creep about at night breaking windows like a common thief? Her contempt silenced many, but not all. For even in her denial, there was that same flicker Miss Marple had noted before, an unease quickly buried beneath hauteur. Colonel Latham, meanwhile, grew more irritable by the hour. He was seen storming across the green, muttering darkly about insolent questions and police meddling. It was clear he feared some connection between his land disputes and the solicitor's papers. Pride made him reckless, and recklessness often betrayed more than silence. Through it all, Miss Marple moved with her usual quiet grace, appearing to notice little, yet observing much. She listened to the tremor in Mrs. Grant's voice, the hard edge in Lady Harrington's laugh, the Colonel's flushed cheeks, and then, in the midst of all this, another revelation came, one that altered the course of the village's speculation entirely. It was Elsie, the maid, who brought it to light, though not intentionally. Miss Marple encountered her one afternoon near the well, where the girl was drawing water with clumsy haste. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. "Why, Elsie," Miss Marple said kindly, "you look quite overset. Too many chores, perhaps?" Elsie hesitated, then blurted, "It's the inspector, miss. He asked me again about that cup, the one Lady Harrington set aside. I told him what I remembered, but, oh, I shouldn't have said anything. Now he'll think I'm accusing her, and if she finds out—" She broke off, biting her lip. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, truth is never wrong, though it may be uncomfortable. Did Lady Harrington set the cup aside, then?" "You are certain?" Elsie nodded miserably. "She said it was for Mr. Chillingworth, because he liked his stronger. She looked straight at me, miss, and I thought nothing of it then. But now, oh, what if she blames me?" There, Miss Marple soothed. "No harm shall come to you for speaking truth. Remember, dear child, that courage in small things is often more important than bravery in grand ones." As Elsie hurried off, Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. This was the hidden clue, confirmed now beyond doubt. The poisoned cup had been prepared deliberately, not by accident, and Lady Harrington had played a hand in ensuring it reached Alfred Chillingworth. Yet another layer unfolded that very night, when word came that a second death had occurred, not by poison but by violence. The body of James Simmons, the greengrocer, was found in the lane, struck down by a heavy blow to the head. A robbery, some whispered, but nothing had been taken. Others muttered that he had known too much, that he had seen something during the fete or after. The shock of this new crime rippled through the village like thunder. 2 deaths in so short a time. This was no accident of fate, but a shadow stalking Raven's Hollow with deliberate intent. Inspector Crail was thrown into confusion, for his neat case against Mrs. Grant no longer sufficed. She might have poisoned Chillingworth, yes, but how could she also be responsible for Simmons, killed in the lane where she had not been seen? The villagers' whispers shifted overnight. Some still clung to Mrs. Grant's guilt, but others now pointed toward Colonel Latham, with his military temper, or Lady Harrington, whose hauteur seemed all the more chilling under the suspicion of 2 deaths. Henry, for his part, declared that Simmons must have discovered something in his uncle's papers, something that cost him his life. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her parlour as the news spread, felt the shape of the pattern grow clearer. 2 deaths, both tied to Alfred Chillingworth's knowledge, both deliberate in their execution. The solicitor had known secrets, and someone feared those secrets might surface. Poison had silenced him. A blow had silenced Simmons. The hand was the same, the method different, but the motive identical: concealment. She folded her knitting with a sigh, her eyes thoughtful. The inspector would chase suspects in circles, driven by pride and impatience. The villagers would chatter and accuse, swayed by fear and envy. But she would watch. She would wait. And when the time came, she would see the final thread drawn tight, revealing the murderer who thought themselves hidden. For the curse of Raven's Hollow was no curse at all, but the consequence of human frailty, of greed, pride, and desperation. And in the quiet wisdom of Miss Marple's mind, the truth was already beginning to glimmer. The shock of James Simmons's death reverberated through Raven's Hollow, with a force greater even than the solicitor's poisoning. One death, however unsettling, might still be attributed to some personal quarrel or hidden grudge, but 2 within days, each under sinister circumstances, spoke unmistakably of something larger, darker, more deliberate. The village was no longer merely uneasy. It was gripped by fear. Doors were locked earlier, shutters closed with nervous haste, and the usual gatherings in parlours and shops dwindled into hushed exchanges carried out with darting glances toward the lane. The lane. Inspector Crail found himself beset on all sides. His neat solution, that Mrs. Grant had poisoned Chillingworth, was slipping through his fingers, for she could scarcely be blamed for Simmons, who had been bludgeoned under the moonlight. 2 killers, then, he muttered in frustration as he surveyed the body, but the words rang hollow even in his own ears. Miss Marple, watching quietly from a respectful distance, saw the truth of his unease. The inspector's mind was methodical, yes, but too rigid, too reluctant to admit when patterns did not conform. He saw 2 murders as separate puzzles. She already knew they were threads of the same tapestry. The villagers, as ever, had no shortage of theories. Some whispered that Simmons had been blackmailing Chillingworth, that his knowledge of illicit dealings had doomed them both. Others declared that Simmons had stumbled upon the burglar in the solicitor's office and paid with his life for seeing too much. There were those who insisted it was all the work of an outsider, a tramp, or one of those men from the railway, Mr. Penfold muttered darkly. But such explanations comforted no one. Ravens Hollow had lived too long in the intimacy of shared history to truly believe an outsider had wrought such havoc. The murderer, they feared, was one of their own. Miss Marple, sipping her tea in her neat little parlour, turned the matter over in her mind. She thought again of Elsie's frightened words, of Lady Harrington's hand setting aside the cup, of the burglary at the office, and now of Simmons struck down. There was a line, she knew, connecting them all. Alfred Chillingworth had held secrets, dangerous ones. Someone had feared exposure. The poisoned tea, the ransacked office, the greengrocer's sudden death. They were not isolated events, but stages of the same design, driven by the same desperate hand. It was the burglary that lingered most vividly in her thoughts. The timing had been too precise. If Simmons had indeed stumbled upon something among Chillingworth's papers, perhaps in the course of his frequent deliveries, then his silence was imperative. And silence had been achieved brutally. That, Miss Marple knew, was often the way. Poison when there was time for subtlety, a blow when there was none. The shift in method did not suggest 2 criminals, but one, cornered and increasingly reckless. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby at the vicarage. The poor woman was still pale from the double shock, her eyes haunted by the thought that such violence had unfolded during her fate. She received Miss Marple with gratitude, pressing tea upon her despite trembling hands. "It is dreadful, Jane," she murmured. "First poor Mr. Chillingworth, and now James. The village is beside itself. My husband tries to reassure them, but how can he when we ourselves are so shaken? Oh, what has Ravens Hollow come to?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "It is always disquieting, my dear, when hidden matters come to the surface, for they do so in the most unexpected ways. But tell me, at the fete, do you recall seeing James Simmons near the tea tent?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned in concentration. "Yes, now that you mention it. He brought a basket of apples for the stall just before it happened." "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Miss Marple said gently, though in her mind the thought stirred. Simmons had been close enough, perhaps, to see Lady Harrington's little manoeuvre with the cup, close enough to observe what others had missed. That would explain why he had to be silenced after Chillingworth's death. The clue was falling into place, faint but undeniable. Later that day, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane, where she encountered Henry Chillingworth leaning against the churchyard wall, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. "They've killed again," he said without preamble, "and still they try to blame Mrs. Grant. It isn't her, Miss Marple, I know it isn't. I've been looking through my uncle's papers, at least those that remain. He was corresponding with someone abroad, someone about money. Lady Harrington, I'm sure of it. He was pressing her, and she couldn't allow it. She killed him, and now Simmons too, because he guessed her secret." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet compassion. "You are very certain, Henry. But certainty, you know, can be dangerous. It blinds one to possibilities. But you think it was her too, don't you?" he pressed, his voice urgent. She smiled faintly. "I think many things, dear boy. But thought must be tempered by proof, and proof by observation. Do not rush, Henry. Patience is often the greater weapon." He looked frustrated, but she saw his shoulders sag with reluctant acceptance. Youth longs for resolution, but Miss Marple had learned the wisdom of waiting. That evening, as the inspector convened another meeting at the inn, Miss Marple slipped quietly into a corner, listening as the villagers gave their statements. Colonel Latham blustered once more about his quarrel being of no consequence. Lady Harrington dismissed accusations with cold disdain. Mrs. Grant wept quietly, protesting her innocence, and Henry spoke hotly of secrets and debts. The inspector, weary and short-tempered, seemed more inclined than ever to force an arrest, but the new crime stayed his hand. For the first time his confidence faltered, and Miss Marple saw in him a flicker of doubt. When the meeting broke, she remained seated, pretending to fumble with her shawl, until the others had left. Then, with the calm of one accustomed to small domestic maneuvers, she spoke softly to the inspector. "You have been most diligent, Inspector. Yet might I offer a little thought?" Crail eyed her warily. "If you must, Miss Marple." She smiled serenely. "When one seeks to conceal something, one often draws more attention than one means to. I have known many a lady who, wishing to hide a spot upon her dress, placed her hand just so, and thereby made every eye notice it. The same is true of teacups and letters, Inspector. The very act of setting something apart, of insisting it is one person's and no other's, may be the greatest clue of all." He frowned, clearly puzzled, and she did not elaborate. It was not yet the time. She gathered her things and left, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender and the impression that she had said something significant without saying it at all. As she walked home beneath the rising moon, Miss Marple knew that the moment was approaching when she must act. The threads of the pattern had grown tight. Lady Harrington's insistence upon the cup, the burglary for letters, Simmons silenced, all pointed in one direction. Yet she could not present it boldly. The inspector would not accept deduction alone. What was needed was a test, a small deliberate touch upon human nature, one that would coax the guilty hand into betraying itself. She had done such things before. A well-placed remark, a seemingly innocent question, a feigned forgetfulness. These were the tools that revealed truth more surely than any magnifying glass or fingerprint. And she already knew upon whom to try it. The following morning she rose early, her mind composed, her plan gentle but firm. She would visit Lady Harrington, not with accusation but with curiosity, and she would place before her a small temptation, just enough to stir unease, to provoke a reaction. For in Miss Marple's long observation of human nature, it was never grand confessions that unmasked the guilty, but the tiny cracks in composure, the trembling of a hand, the flicker of an eye. She adjusted her hat, gathered her knitting bag, and stepped out into the morning light. The village was still restless, but Miss Marple walked with quiet certainty. The net was drawing close, though no one yet knew it. And soon, very soon, Raven's Hollow would see the truth revealed, not by force of law, but by the gentle, inexorable hand of human nature, which never failed to betray itself in the end. The end. A Lady Harrington received Miss Marple in her drawing-room, with all the hauteur of a woman determined to guard her position. The curtains were drawn against the morning sun, the room heavy with the scent of polished wood and lavender sachets. She sat upright in a carved chair, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression coolly impassive. "Miss Marple," she said with a faint note of surprise, "I did not expect callers so early. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple, whose step was a trifle slower than usual, but whose eyes were as sharp as ever, settled herself on the edge of the sofa, setting down her knitting bag with practiced delicacy. "Oh, my dear Lady Harrington, I hope you will forgive me. I so dislike calling unannounced, but I thought perhaps you might appreciate a friendly word in these difficult times. Villagers can be cruel with their gossip, and I dare say your name has been rather, unfortunately, entangled." Lady Harrington's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, though her eyes remained hard. "Yes, I am aware of the whisperings. One expects as much when envy stirs small minds. I assure you, Miss Marple, I am perfectly capable of rising above such chatter." Of course, Miss Marple murmured, as she smoothed the yarn between her fingers. "And yet I always say a village tongue can be more dangerous than any weapon. Poor Mr. Simmons, for instance, he was rather fond of repeating what he heard. It is such a pity he will not be repeating anything more. The words, spoken so gently, caused the smallest shift in Lady Harrington's posture. Her shoulders stiffened, and for one fleeting instant her eyes flickered. Not with sorrow, but with calculation. Miss Marple noticed, though she kept her gaze downcast as though intent upon her knitting. "You cannot mean to imply," Lady Harrington said after a moment, "that his death had anything to do with me?" Her tone was sharp, though restrained. "My dear lady, I imply nothing," Miss Marple replied, her voice light and soothing. "I only reflect upon how very unlucky it is when two deaths occur so near one another, and how very curious it seems that both gentlemen had reason to concern themselves with certain papers in Mr. Chillingworth's office." "Quite curious indeed." Lady Harrington's gloved hand twitched, the fingers curling as though to grip the arm of her chair more tightly. "You do enjoy your little observations, Miss Marple, but I dare say the inspector will conclude soon enough. He appears rather convinced that Mrs. Grant is to blame, and I, for one, see no reason to contradict him." Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest of sighs. "Yes, the inspector is very thorough, but then one must be careful about conclusions. I once knew a lady who insisted her parlour maid had stolen a brooch, and she accused her most fiercely. It turned out the brooch had slipped between the sofa cushions, and the maid, poor girl, lost her place quite unfairly. I only mention it because appearances are so often deceptive. Even a cup of tea set aside with the kindest intention may mean something very different indeed." There it was, a barely perceptible tremor in Lady Harrington's composure, like a crack in a polished vase. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly, her eyes flashing for a fraction of a second before she mastered herself again. She rose with an air of cool dismissal. "If you have quite finished, Miss Marple, I have matters to attend to." Of course, Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting. "You must forgive me. I do chatter on, so thank you for indulging an old woman's fancies." She left with her usual unhurried step, but in her heart she knew the test had worked. Lady Harrington's control was formidable, but not unbreakable. The tremor, the flicker of the eyes, the too quick eagerness to direct suspicion elsewhere, all confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Yet it was not proof enough, not yet. The inspector would demand more than the reading of gestures and the subtleties of tone. She would need to arrange matters so that Lady Harrington revealed herself more plainly. That evening, Miss Marple attended another of the inspector's meetings at the inn, listening as the villagers debated once more. Colonel Latham blustered about his honour. Mrs. Grant wept softly at the injustice of her continued suspicion. Henry declared with youthful fervour that the true criminal was still at large, and Lady Harrington sat in cold silence, her gaze steady and unyielding. It was then that Miss Marple, in her quiet way, dropped a seed into the soil of conversation. "I dare say," she remarked mildly, "that whoever ransacked Mr. Chillingworth's office must have been searching for something very specific. I cannot help wondering if they found it. Perhaps a letter, perhaps a deed, perhaps nothing at all. But if they did not, well then it must still be somewhere, mustn't it? And that would mean it might yet be discovered." The words, though delivered in the tone of idle speculation, had their intended effect. Lady Harrington's head turned sharply, just for an instant, her eyes narrowing before she looked away. Henry, however, seized upon the idea with enthusiasm. "Yes, if the papers weren't destroyed, they must still exist, and if we can find them, we'll know the truth." The inspector frowned. "Speculation, Miss Marple. We mustn't lead people astray." "Oh, quite right, Inspector," Miss Marple said serenely. It was only a thought, but she saw Lady Harrington's gloved hands tighten in her lap, and she knew that thought had lodged itself where it was needed. A guilty conscience, she knew, would rarely let such a suggestion pass unanswered. 2 days later, Miss Marple set the final part of her test into motion. She arranged, quite innocently, to speak with Elsie again, choosing a moment when Lady Harrington happened to be near the churchyard. She spoke just loudly enough, her voice carrying with that peculiar clarity the elderly sometimes command, though her words seemed intended only for the maid. "It is strange," she said, "how often important papers end up in the most ordinary places. Cupboards, trunks, even the folds of a tea-tablecloth. I remember once a whole set of letters was found tucked into a hymn book, quite overlooked until a most unfortunate time." Elsie, wide-eyed, nodded uncertainly, but it was not her reaction Miss Marple was watching. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Lady Harrington pause in her stride, her shoulders stiffening, before she walked briskly on. Her telling reaction, too swift to be considered, too instinctive to be feigned. That evening, when Miss Marple sat by her window, she was not surprised to see a figure moving stealthily in the direction of the old rectory storehouse, where some of Chillingworth's belongings had been taken for safekeeping. The moon was thin, the lane quiet, but Miss Marple's eyes, though aged, missed nothing. Lady Harrington, dressed in a dark cloak, slipped inside with the furtive air of one who seeks what must never be found. Never be found. Miss Marple did not follow. That was not her way. She left the matter to the inspector, whom she had already warned with the gentlest of hints. If one were to keep watch, she had said, one might find the most curious comings and goings. And so, as Lady Harrington emerged with a bundle clasped to her breast, she found herself confronted by Inspector Crail and a constable. There was no dramatic confession, no outcry. Lady Harrington merely drew herself up, her chin high, her eyes flashing with cold fury. "You have no right at all," she said. But in her hands were the very letters Chillingworth had kept, correspondence that revealed her precarious finances, her debts, and his threats to expose her unless she yielded. The inspector, triumphant, seized upon it at once. "This proves it. She killed him to silence him, and Simmons because he knew too much." Miss Marple, however, raised one mild hand. "It proves motive, Inspector, but not the act itself. We must be cautious. One must not confuse opportunity with certainty. Still, it does bring us very near, does it not?" Her eyes, resting gently upon Lady Harrington's rigid figure, saw what others did not. The faint tremor in the woman's lips, the sheen of sweat beneath her carefully composed mask. The test had worked. Lady Harrington was crumbling, though not yet openly. The time for the final reveal was drawing close, and Miss Marple, in her quiet way, knew the truth had almost fully stepped into the light. The vicarage drawing-room was crowded that evening, the air heavy with anticipation. Inspector Crail had insisted upon gathering all those most closely concerned. Lady Harrington, her face pale but still proud. Colonel Latham, restless and defensive. Mrs. Grant, fragile and tearful. Henry Chillingworth, tense and eager. Mrs. Weatherby, wringing her hands in distress. And in the midst of them all sat Miss Marple, small and quiet in her armchair, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes lowered demurely, as though she were nothing more than a kindly old lady who had stumbled into the company by mistake. Yet when Inspector Crail, his voice brusque and assured, announced that Lady Harrington would be charged with the murder of Alfred Chillingworth, it was Miss Marple who spoke, her voice soft but carrying through the room like the chime of a small silver bell. "If I may, Inspector, before you proceed." Crail frowned, but something in her tone stilled him. The villagers turned toward her, their faces alight with curiosity. Lady Harrington's chin lifted, her eyes flashing with contempt. "Really, Miss Marple, must you prolong this charade? The inspector has quite made up his mind." "Indeed, Lady Harrington," Miss Marple said gently, "but the truth, I think, is rather more intricate than you suppose. You see, the matter is not one of simple guilt, but of observation. And I have observed." There was a hush as she folded her hands. "It began with the cup of tea. Everyone remembers that poor Mr. Chillingworth was served his cup by Elsie, but only Elsie herself recalled that one particular cup had been set aside by Lady Harrington, at her insistence. That was a curious thing. It seemed at first an act of kindness, but as I reflected, I realized it was also a way of ensuring that one cup and one only went to Mr. Chillingworth. That, I felt, was no accident." Lady Harrington gave a short, bitter laugh. "And you mean to condemn me for charity?" Miss Marple's eyes remained kind, almost apologetic. "Not condemn, my dear, only explain. The truth of human nature is that kindness is rarely so insistent. Then came the burglary of Mr. Chillingworth's office. At first the inspector believed it the act of Mrs. Grant, fearful of exposure. But I have lived long enough to know the difference between panic and calculation. That ransacking was no clumsy effort. It was directed, determined, ruthless. And who had the most to fear from papers of debt and letters abroad? Why, Lady Harrington, whose fortune was not as secure as she allowed her neighbours to believe. Murmurs stirred, but Miss Marple went on, her tone calm and measured. And then, alas, poor James Simmons. Why should he, a greengrocer, be struck down? The answer is that he saw something. He was at the fete near the tea tent, close enough to notice that cup set aside. He may have spoken of it later innocently, without knowing the weight of what he said. But the guilty mind cannot risk discovery. And so Simmons was silenced, not with poison this time, for there was no opportunity, but with violence, swift and brutal. 2 methods, 1 hand. The inspector shifted uneasily, his brow furrowed. You speak with conviction, Miss Marple, but where is your proof? Proof, Inspector, is not always to be found in fingerprints or in powders. Proof lies in behavior, in the small betrayals of human nature. Lady Harrington, when I spoke to you of teacups and papers, you betrayed yourself. Your hand trembled. Your eyes flickered. And when I suggested that the missing letters might yet be discovered, you could not help but act. You went yourself by night to seek them out. That is not the action of an innocent woman. That is the desperation of guilt. Lady Harrington rose suddenly, her face rigid, her voice taut with fury. This is nonsense. Idle gossip from an old spinster, who meddles where she is not wanted. I will not listen. On the contrary, Miss Marple interrupted gently, you have listened very carefully and it has undone you. Had you ignored me, you might still be safe. But you could not ignore me. You went to the rectory storehouse where the inspector was waiting, just as I knew you would. You held the very letters in your hand when he stopped you. Letters in which Mr. Chillingworth threatened to expose your debts, to force your compliance. You feared him. You hated him, and you saw no other way than silence. The room was still. Lady Harrington swayed slightly, as though the weight of Miss Marple's words pressed upon her shoulders. Colonel Latham looked stunned. Mrs. Grant covered her mouth with her hands, and Henry leaned forward with fierce, incredulous eyes. At last, Lady Harrington spoke, her voice low, trembling despite her pride. He would have ruined me. He took pleasure in it, dangling his knowledge like a sword, waiting to cut me down. I had no choice. No choice at all. Miss Marple's voice softened, almost sorrowful. There is always a choice, my dear. But pride is a dangerous companion. It can drive one to desperate acts. Inspector Crail, seizing upon the admission, stepped forward. That will serve well enough. Lady Harrington, I must place you under arrest. But Miss Marple raised her hand once more. Gently, Inspector. She has spoken, yes. But we must remember the dignity of the moment. Raven's Hollow will not be better for scandal shouted in the streets. Let us proceed with quietness. Justice, after all, is best served without cruelty. And so it was that Lady Harrington, still proud but defeated, was led away under the watchful eyes of her neighbours. No cheers rose, no harsh words were spoken. The village was too shaken, too aware of the thin line that separates respectability from disgrace. They dispersed slowly, their whispers hushed, their thoughts uneasy. Later, in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting, her needles clicking steadily. Mrs. Grant came to thank her, tears in her eyes, for having believed in her innocence when no one else would. Henry, too, came, restless with the need to speak, to ask questions, to wrestle with what had been revealed. Do you ever grow weary of it, Miss Marple? He asked at last. Of seeing through people, of finding the worst beneath the surface. She smiled faintly, her eyes resting on the neat row of stitches she had just completed. Not weary, dear boy, saddened sometimes, but also comforted. For you see, while it is true that human nature can be cruel and selfish, it is also true that it can be kind and forgiving. The same patterns appear again and again in wickedness and in goodness alike. One learns to tell them apart and to accept them both. That, I think, is the secret. Henry said nothing more, but when he left, he carried with him a new respect for the gentle old lady whose quiet words had unmasked a killer. As for the village, it slowly returned to its rhythm. The grocer's shop was taken over by a cousin of Simmons. The Fete Committee resumed its planning for the harvest fair, and the vicar preached a sermon on pride and humility that was more closely attended than most. Yet an unease lingered, as it always does when the thin veneer of civility is pierced by violence. Neighbours looked at one another with a shade more caution, and the memory of the poisoned tea and the silent blow in the lane haunted the village green for many months. Miss Marple, however, lived on serenely, her roses blooming, her teapots polished, her knitting always close at hand. She asked nothing for herself, sought no glory. She merely continued to observe, to listen, and to reflect upon the curious ways of human nature. And when, in years to come, villagers spoke of the summer fete that turned so deadly, they always remembered the quiet figure in the straw hat who had seen what no one else had seen, and who, with gentleness and unerring clarity, had revealed the truth of the silent curse of Raven's Hollow.